Elisabetta Ciucarelli and Lourdes Vidal, for allowing us to occupy this space twice a year, every year since 3 years now, and to make possible for us to invite people of considerable status, such as our guest today. As director of the UAB Master's Program in Contemporary Arabic Studies, it is for me a pleasure and an honor to introduce you today to two persons that I personally deeply admire. Two persons who have in common a profound knowledge and love for music. Safi El-Hafez is a Syrian musician, lute player, member of the Orpheus 21 Orchestra, and staff member of the Master of Contemporary Arabic Studies, where he lectures Arabic music, contemporary Arabic music. And of course, our respectable guest, Professor Dr. Mena Hanna, musician, musicologist, and dean of the prestigious Barenboim-Said Academy in Berlin. Since Safi will be in charge of introducing Dr. Hanna and the BSA, I am not going to expand any further on this introduction. Just the last special acknowledgement for Hanna, for Dr. Hanna, for having accepted our invitation today. I am really looking forward to hearing what you're going to explain to us, and I'm sure it will be extremely interesting. So I give now the floor to Professor Safi El-Hafez, and I remind you all only that at the end of the session we will have 15 minutes to your questions to open dialogue. So if you want to wait until the end, that would be perfect, because we began a little bit later for technical problems related to my incompetence, not to anyone else. Thank you very much, and Safi, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Anna, very much for introducing us. First of all, hello everybody. It's a privilege for me to be here, sharing the speech with Dr. Mena and Dr. Anna. Thanks a lot for the European Institute of Mediterranean and the Autonomous University of Barcelona for their efforts in organizing this conference. In this evening, we will talk about decolonization of music. First of all, I want to make a little bit or short introduction before I introduce you to Dr. Mena. Actually, we will talk about the necessity of decolonization of music in this time. How can we can decolonize our music? Decolonizing music involves a conscious decision to move away from the either-or mentality to both and mentality. So we really need, however, it's not about replacing one style or genre with another, but we must be open to another approaches and becoming. We must be open and accepting of the new music as well as old, of a classical music as well as popular, improvised as well as notated, and on it goes. In order to adequately and effectively decolonize music, we must become reconcilers, or we must become, let's say it in a musical term, harmonizers. We must reconcile with the new traditions, affirming the both and mentality and dismissing the either or. We shouldn't let our traditions swallow up the new, but we should not allow the new to swallow up our traditions. Both the new and the traditional are vital to are vital to a healthy state of musical and cultural affairs. We must maintain a creative tension between our traditions on the one hand and the new on the other hand. And of course, Dr. Mena will go further in this lecture. Dr. Mena Mark Hanna is Dean of the Barenboim-Said Academy. He received his PhD from Oxford University's Merton College, where he studied musicology and music composition. Prior to coming to the Barenboim-Said Academy, Hanna was assistant artistic director and dramaturg at Houston Grand Opera and visiting scholar and lecturer in musicology at Rice University's Shepherd School of Music. Hanna also teaches musicology at the Academy. His researches and teaching interests include Middle Eastern chant, music of the 20th and 21st centuries, and compositions and electronic music. His PhD thesis toward a structural theory of Coptic chant is a forthcoming publication by the Ginkgo Library, distributed by University of Chicago Press. He is a recipient of the Marshall Scholarship, the James Ingham Halstead Traveling Scholarship at the BMI Young Composer Award. His compositions have been premiered at the Foundation Royamont, the Darmstadt New Music Festival, and ISCM World Music Days, and performed by Ensemble Linia, Les Cris de Paris, the Kigguns Ensemble, and the Momenta Quartet, and others. Hello, Mr. Dr. Mena. It's a privilege really to be here with you, and please, if you tell us more about this topic.
Yep. Thank you very much for having me today, and thank you very much to you, Safi El-Hafiz, and of course to you, Dr. Anna Gelbardia, for this invitation. It's such a privilege to be here, and of course, thank you to the Instituto Europeo del Mediterrània. Sorry, Spanish is not my first language, as you can see. But it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm very excited to be here, and I'm going to probably have to move over there to deliver my lecture and also control the slides. So as you can see, I've chosen a somewhat provocative title for this lecture, A Horribly Discordant Noise, the Problem of Colonization in Classical Music. And I hope it'll be revealed why I've decided to call it this. So, let's see, let's do this, and then that. Good. 2 years ago, can everybody hear me? Yeah? Yes. 2 years ago, I heard a contemporary piece by a highly regarded German composer, written in 2013, for solo clarinet performed in Berlin. The final movement of the piece was titled Danse Africaine. The clarinetist sat in the middle of the concert hall, lowered the instrument into a microphone, and played with a heavy breath tone and loud key clicks. The piece is highly virtuosic, both compositionally and technically, using various implements of breath tone, of half-audible pitch tones, and degrees of key click intensity. Amplified by the microphone, the result is a crude imitation of Khoisan click language, or perhaps some mimicry of some primitive percussion instrument. The clarinetist explored this texture of key click musical language, and then, with increasing dynamics and increasing tempo, soared into a loud, jarring multiphonic that was somewhat reminiscent of an elephant call. The piece went on in this manner, with tension building through alternating Orientalist signifiers to a ferocious crescendo, until the clarinetist jumped out of his seat, yelling, "Ah!" accompanied by a high-pitched, clanging, primitive-sounding multiphonic. So the performance ends with a primitive cry of the savage on the dark continent. And amidst hearty applause from the audience, I sat transfixed by the weird and apparent racism I had witnessed. all the more amplified by an acquiescent, if not downrightly enthusiastic public. What does this story tell us about the state of classical music, which I will refer variously in this lecture to Western art music? So I think part of the answer to this question can be potentially found in 2 points. It can be found in more than 2 points, but due to time constraints, I'm going to concentrate on 2 points, and hopefully I'll have time for those 2 points. The first is the academic study of non-Western music. Its collection, investigation, and inclusion into the Akademie has been founded in a kind of bias colored by a social and structural prejudice. This field, which we call ethnomusicology, and it's already a slightly problematic title for the field, started out as being called Vergleichende Musikwissenschaft in German, or comparative musicology, and has, in the words of musicologist Kofi Agawu, wrestled most self-consciously with matters of representation. And then the second point. To me, Danse Africaine is not a standalone aberration, but the result of a still thoroughly colonized medium. That is to say that modern-day classical music, or Western art music, this performance tradition is still mostly rooted in the 19th century, or at least in a simulacrum of the 19th century, or in some sort of generative replication of what people think the 19th century is. And it is through this petrified performance practice that most of Western art music repertory is still expressed, disseminated, and largely formed. So, on to the first topic, the ethnomusicology topic. I first became cognizant of the internal structural prejudices and biases that exist in Western art music and its scholarship while writing my doctoral dissertation on Coptic chant, a long-standing Christian chant tradition of Egypt. In the 1920s and 30s, Ernest Newland-Smith, a self-described musicologist, was hired by Dr. Rahab Muftah, the 20th century champion of Coptic chant preservation, to transcribe Coptic chant into Western notation in a valiant effort to save the oral, monodic, non-notated musical tradition with supposedly 4,000-year-old pharaonic roots. The collected transcriptions occupy some 18 folio volumes in the Library of Congress, and they're fascinating in both what they reveal and what they withhold. Newland-Smith's attempt at transcription was effectively, and transcription means to take this oral thing and try to transmit it into a Western notational structure. So his attempt at transcription was effectively a culturally Christian European designation of a musical system that is in reality an indescribably complex mosaic of several cultural forces in the region, with musical signifiers from Islamic musical traditions and its derivatives, from Mizrahic, from Byzantine and Oriental Orthodox traditions. One of the defining features of Coptic chant is its inimitable, almost non-transcribable, semi-improvised microtonal ornamentation which defies the strict metering of Western music. So I think in order to properly demonstrate this, I should sing an example. Estasi meta vovo theio, o cosumento agio, evangelio. Newland-Smith's transcriptions, on the other hand, boil the chants down to simplistic Western tropes, even meters and time signatures, strictly diatonic tonalities, phrases that are constructed in an antecedent and consequent manner. Basically, the chants sound like they belong in an Anglican hymnal. This is what they look like to him. And I can sing this one, and I'll even use the same words, in the same key. Estasi te meta vovo theo, acosomen tuagio, evangelio. very different, and it's not really accurate either. In his lecture delivered at the University of Oxford on the 21st of May, 1931, Newland Smith says, "It is true that I had to dig deep, for the original Egyptian element lies largely buried under an appalling debris of Arabic ornamentation. But after piercing through this unfortunate outer coat, the true Egyptian idiom has emerged. The music is not Arabic, it is not Turkish, and it is not Greek, often as these elements appear. It seems indeed impossible to doubt, but that it is ancient Egyptian. Moreover, it is great music, grand, pathetic, noble, and deeply spiritual." Now, this specific reading of Coptic chant is one that persists within the Coptic Church, within the congregants of the Coptic Church, within adherents to the Coptic faith to this day, and has in its origins a Western exoticization of the East. The phrase, "the original Egyptian element lies largely buried under an appalling debris of Arabic ornamentation," especially stands out to me. How here we are already othering something else. We already have an othering going on, something that is Egyptian and not Arabic. It goes back to this binary that Safi al-Hafiz mentioned in his introduction. And this Arabic stuff is described in archaeological terms as debris, as the collected rubbish of centuries. And this either-or distinction of Egyptian and Arabic is key in a post-Tutankhamun, Howard Carter-crazed England of the 1920s and 30s, which fetishized anything that had to do with ancient Egypt. The quote also betrays something of an imperialist narrative, and here I'm being a little coy. But really, by connecting Coptic music with the music of the ancient pharaohs, which again is a fallacy, it's not true, Newland Smith accomplishes two things. One, the music immediately becomes an immutable, collectible artifact in a museological sense, denying the participants of the music a living tradition which has changes in canon, composition, and repertory. This description gives the music a static quality and diverges the musical corpus from a contemporary practice tradition. In a way, if this could be collected and placed into the British Museum, it would be collected and placed into the British Museum. The second point, this reinforces that the Coptic Christian minority of Egypt and their music has nothing to do with Arabic Egypt, with Islamic Egypt, folding into a wider narrative of Western demonization of the Muslim Middle East, which has resulted in historic and current Western intervention in the region on behalf of a Christian minority. This is a sentiment as old as the medieval Crusades and still stokes the fires of sectarianism all over the Middle East, from Michel Chihaz's idealized constitutional enshrinement of sectarianism in the French Mandate of Lebanon and its disastrous consequences that we're seeing today, which obviously go back to the Lebanese Civil War, but even in Lebanon's current state of political paralysis, to the most recent casus belli of Russia's intervention in Syria. Russian Orthodox clergy have been seen blessing fighter jets. Official statements from the Russian Orthodox Church have described the conflict with the Islamic State as a holy war. And as recently as December of 2018, Putin has vowed to rebuild Christian Syria. This is all part of a long political narrative. So when I first read Newland Smith's description, I presumed he was a reflection of the predictably prescriptive views of the era in which he wrote, the 1930s, and that these prejudices were the result of outdated attitudes. Such an assumption, I think, on my part, was a bit patronizing. And now, when reflecting more on what he wrote, I think of Edward Said's observation when writing about Joseph Conrad, Newland Smith's early 20th century compatriot. And Said writes, "I doubt that recent attitudes in Washington and among most Western policymakers and intellectuals have shown little advance over his years. London, Washington, Paris, they haven't changed, and neither has music, both in the continual orientalizing in studies of non-European music and within the cultural material commonly referred to as classical music. Now, to step back for a moment, I want to go back to my opening anecdote of that piece, Danse Africaine. I would like to read a passage from Richard Lander's Records of Captain Clapperton's Last Expedition to Africa, published in 1830. This excerpt also appears and is quoted by Kofi Agawo in his 1992 article representing African music in the journal Critical Inquiry. Here's the quote. On the morning of Thursday the 12th, we left Chiadu, followed by the chief and an immense crowd of both sexes, amongst whom were hundreds of children, the ladies enlivening us with songs at intervals, and the men blowing on horns and beating on gongs and drums, without any regard to time, forming altogether a most barbarous concert of vocal and instrumental music, which continued to our great inconvenience and annoyance till we arrived at Matone, when they took leave of us and returned. It would be as difficult to detach singing and dancing from the character of an African as to change the color of his skin. I do not think he would live a single week in his country without participating in these, his favorite amusements, to deprive him of which would be indeed worse than death. Yet, even on these instruments, they perform most vilely and produce a horribly discordant noise, which may, perhaps, be delightful to their own ears, but to strangers. If they have the misfortune to be too near to the performers, no sounds can be more harsh and disagreeable than such a concert. To drive the point further home, I'll finally reveal the piece itself that I mentioned in the opening of this lecture. You can find everything on YouTube these days. And here we go. That's the piece. I mean, I think we can see here in the example of Danse Africaine a really interesting corollary. Western art music is still exchanging and participating in the norms and tropes of 19th century imperialists, just like the excerpt I read. And sure, one can say Jörg Widmann, that his piece is an attempt at satire, but how satirical is it really when everyone in the concert hall who is lauding the piece and cheering it on is white and European? Is that satire? I don't think it is. You can't exclude people from certain experiences, either through intention or by organic heterotopia, and then have those people be the object of your work and call it satire. So it's not satire. It's exchanging the norms and perpetrating the norms and perpetuating the norms of imperialism. On to the next point, Aida. It doesn't get better, unfortunately. When we look at the formation of Western art music we see that there is basically a harmonic homogenization from roughly 1650 to 1900. We call this period the Common Practice period, and it starts with the establishment of the tonal system till its dissolution at the end of the 19th century. Almost all widely promulgated canonic pieces date from this period, and the period's most famous formal conventions, for example, the symphony orchestra or the Hegelian sonata allegro form, have permeated this repertory and the education of this repertory. Most pieces we hear in the concert hall today date even more so specifically from the classical and romantic periods, roughly from 1750 to 1910, and pieces by composers such as Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, Schubert, Bellini, Rossini, Berlioz, Chopin, Brahms, Liszt, Tchaikovsky, Verdi, and Wagner are all from this period. All the composers I mentioned are canonic, and the majority were writing music in the second half of the 19th century. Like all artistic production of the century, which coincided with the height of the European imperialistic project, many of these pieces have either an explicit Orientalism or some sort of residual structure of a self and other binary. This is nothing new. Edward Said wrote about the explicit Orientalism in Verdi's Aida in Culture and Imperialism, and we'll get to that in a minute. And since he wrote that, many musicologists and critics have had similar takes on Rossini's Italiana in Algeri, Mozart's Così fan tutte, Die Entführung aus dem Serail by Mozart, Meyerbeer's L'Africaine, Saint-Saëns' Samson et Dalila. All of these pieces have some sort of Orientalist archetypes that persist in these narrative works. The comic and benevolent pasha, the beautiful submissive Oriental female, the European tenor hero, as opposed to the savage, often obstinate, tribal bass chieftain. It should be noted that some operas do invert these Orientalist stock characters. Pinkerton in Madame Butterfly is most certainly not an empathetic character. He's an American lieutenant, and he's a horrible person. But these works still exchange in cultural stereotype, and they do it orally as well. Operas, and all those that I mentioned, are the most obvious examples of Orientalism in music. The problem with these examples is that they are based entirely on narrative structures, and therefore the performance tradition of 19th century Western art music is more or less ignored. This ignorance belies a persistent, insistent, and insidious power structure within the performance of Western art music. Western art music, and let's actually call it in this instant classical music, functions effectively as a cultural bomb. This is a word from Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Decolonizing the Mind. And wa Thiong'o says a cultural bomb annihilates a people's belief in their names, in their languages, in their environment, in their heritage of struggle, in their unity, in their capacities, and ultimately in themselves. The best example of this is the symphony orchestra itself. The dominant strain of the cultural product is a simulacrum of the 19th century European orchestra, a recreation of music that has stayed stagnant since the height of European music's dominance in the 19th century. Sure, we have experimentations with electronic music. We have modern A and distonalities. With non-Western instruments, we have differing performance practices. But these phenomena are perceived by the classical music culture industry as exactly what they are, experimentations on the fringe of the mighty 19th century canon. Now, if we look at Aida, again, and jump off from Said's work in Culture and Imperialism, the example becomes all the more stark, since the 19th century work has accompanied and, in a way, even been instrumentalized to comment upon the political, economic, social, and cultural changes of Egypt from the late 19th century to today. In order to understand Aida and its centrality in modern Egyptian culture, we need to know a little bit about its history. Khedive Ismail, the ruler of Egypt and Sudan from 1863 to 1879, commissioned the opera with the opening of Cairo's new Khedivial Opera House in mind, but the Franco-Prussian War delayed the premiere because Aida's sets and costumes were trapped during the siege of Paris in 1870. At that time, Egypt was a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire, and Khedive Ismail was working to establish Egypt's independence. His dabbling in European art was a way of demonstrating a type of cultural autonomy. Ismail was so pro-Western that he claimed in an 1879 statement, "My country is no longer in Africa. We are now part of Europe. It is therefore natural for us to abandon our former ways and to adopt a new system adapted to our social conditions." Egypt's Khedive had great European ambitions for his country. Contrarily, Giuseppe Verdi had no connection with Egypt and did not seem to have much admiration for modern or ancient Egyptian culture. In a letter to the Paris opera impresario Camille Delocle, who had just returned from a trip to Egypt in February 1868, Verdi writes, "When we see each other, you must describe all the events of your voyage, the wonders you have seen, and the beauty and ugliness of a country which once had a greatness and a civilization I had never been able to admire." How could an Italian, who claims to have little appreciation of Egypt, and who never even visited the country, write an opera which became so definitive for Egyptian culture? That's the question here. One, he was very well paid. Verdi received over 500,000 euros in today's purchasing power to write this opera. He was also flattered. Verdi was chosen ahead of his main rivals, Wagner and Gounod. And he liked the story. After Don Carlo, which was more or less a flop, Verdi wanted to write an ambitious grand opera with ballet, and he partly blamed the failure of Don Carlo on the unwieldy nature of the story. It's a transcription, it's an adaptation of a Schiller play. With Aida, Verdi had a neat story of forbidden love with political undertones coming to him from an academic source, the French Egyptologist Auguste Mariette. That's a 19th century academic source, but an academic source nonetheless. When Khedive Ismail, second point, approached Verdi, Verdi was presented with the opportunity to create a work of grandeur and gravity for a non-European country, a work whose every detail he could supervise from the comfort of Europe. In this endeavor, Verdi was supported by royalty, having been personally commissioned by the ruler of Egypt. Additionally, and perhaps most importantly, Verdi had the academic and intellectual authority to adapt an ancient Egyptian story into opera through Auguste Mariette, who oversaw the costume and set designs. Ancient Egypt is certainly the most faraway and exotic setting Verdi ever used in an opera. And Verdi's relationship with Mariette was likely the first time a European opera composer relied upon an academic authority about a subject of which he had very little knowledge. However, Mariette's intellectual heritage and lineage is pretty suspect. It was quite imperial. Mariette got a lot of his information, and this is written in oodles in Said's Orientalism, from the archaeological volumes of Napoléon's Description de l'Égypte and Champion's Deciphering of Hieroglyphics et Lettres à Monsieur Dacier, and Précis du Système Hiéroglyphique, works which were facilitated by military expedition and are pivotal predecessors to Auguste Mariette's world and his work and his intellectual milieu. Even though Mariette ransacked ancient Egypt and ransacked those archaeological sites and sent them back to the Louvre, which was the custom at the time, he was actually appointed as Egypt's first director of antiquities by Khedive Ismail's father. Moreover, Mariette was the principal designer of antiquities at the Egyptian Pavilion at the Paris exhibition of 1867, which, Said points out, was one of the greatest and earliest displays of imperial potency. So in summary with Aida, we have 1, a vision of Egypt which is thoroughly Europeanized and formed through the optic of colonization, a perspective, Said would argue, that is typically Orientalist. So let's just think about that definition again. That's the subtle and persistent Eurocentric prejudice against Arabo-Islamic peoples and their cultures. A culture that is depicted by European art as underdeveloped, as stagnant, as inferior to Western society. Let's think, of course, of the famous painting by Jean-Léon Gérôme, the snake charmer. And this is evident in Aida when one compares Verdi's academic sources with the fully realized opera. And two, one can actually see the plot of Aida as a dramatic allegory of colonization. In the opera, Radamés leads the Egyptian army to defeat an Ethiopian force, but he is denounced as a traitor and sentenced to death. Ancient Egypt's conquest of the dark savages of the south evokes 19th century colonialism in and of itself. It's like built, it's a play within a play. And with setting Radamés, the heroic tenor, as an Egyptian, and then Aida, the beautiful captive savage princess that he falls in love with, as a soprano and his love interest, and the Ethiopian from the south, European audiences are actually invited to watch the opera from the perspective of the ancient Egyptians in the opera. And there is certainly a showing of imperial strength in Aida, which reaches its zenith in the famous Act 2, Scene 2 triumphal march, when Radamés returns from his Ethiopian conquest. Now, this scene always evokes major controversy in its depiction, of black and brown Africans. So I'm going to show it to you. And I think now, more and more opera houses are refusing to do blackface and brownface, thankfully, because of the rather pernicious history of what that evokes and what that is. But this has been a typical rendering of the opera, which we'll watch now. pay attention to this musical theme. This is the ballet representation of the savage Africans, captives of the Egyptian army. This is a production from the late 90s. Okay, I think that's good for now. But I think we've seen a lot here, and we certainly see the representation of Black Africans in modern opera. Yeah, I said this is a production that dates from the late 90s, but it's been remounted several times. And I think it's only as recently as this past year, La Scala, the opera house where this has been shot, has finally started to refuse to do black and brown face for Aida. So there's been progress. But this is a persistent problem. And I could talk a little bit more personally about it when I sort of finish the more formal points of this lecture. Now, just keep in mind the music you heard, specifically that sort of trumpet march bit, which is quite famous, the triumphal march as it's called. You know, modern Egyptians still associate this music with martial victory. I mean, at some point even, I think it was even suggested as a national anthem for Egypt in the 1950s, which is hilariously ludicrous. But you can see how much this music has a kind of currency in Egypt when we look at my next clip here.
Welcome to Egypt's Red Sea Riviera, where the sun always shines, every day of every year.
Maybe I should have called the lecture Red Sea Riviera. But I think this is a very funny ad because it uses the music from Aida very purposefully, and it's clearly targeted to Europeans. I don't know if there was an Egyptian person in the ad at all. And again, it decouples Egypt as an inhabited state of nearly 90 million people from this marketed exotic Egypt that people can purchase and sort of have some sort of exotic touristic experience in. And the vehicle of that is still Verdi's Triumphal March. It's absolutely incredible. See, the thing is, Aida is not about 19th century Egypt. It's not really even about ancient Egypt. And it's not about the Egypt that is coetaneous or contemporaneous with Verdi's time. It's about an ancient Egypt that is a European construct of the Orient. Just like Danse Africaine is a construct of the Black Continent, or even how Newland Smith's approximation of Coptic chant in the early 20th century is a construct of Middle Eastern Christendom's inheritance of a glorified ancient world to bypass and detach from the region's modern reality. These constructs persist, and they're dangerous. They're problematic. They wreak political havoc and have power over public imagination. They perpetuate Orientalist narratives in Europe and in the United States. They provide a second replicative voice instead of a contrapuntal one, which is what we should be trying to do in music, particularly with the continued problematic portrayal of the Middle East in the media. They are fodder for journalistic cliches on the Middle East, as when the New York Times offhandedly and formulaically referred to Shia resistance to Sunni incursion in the Iran-Iraq war as the Shia penchant for martyrdom. Especially in the United States, and unfortunately to a growing degree in Germany, these constructs also hinder serious political conversation about Palestine and Israel. Worst of all, these constructs continue to reduce the peoples of the Middle East and Africa to a single quantifiable whole. I read with a certain circumspection when the Austrian musicologist Franz, in Matthias Enar's book, Compass, or Buzol, he muses to himself that ISIS beheadings must be as horrifying to him, a European, as they are to an Iranian or a Turk. And I know that in this instance, even though this is a book of fiction, that thought is not fiction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hanna, for this incredible, very interesting, deep conference about music and Orientalism.